The thunder of hooves against the dry earth competed with Margaret Ellwood's voice as she sang at the top of her lungs, riding her chestnut mare across the open plains of Wyoming Territory, 1875. Her song carried across the valley, echoing off the distant mountains as the morning sun painted the landscape in hues of gold and amber. Freedom tasted like the dust on her lips and the wind in her hair, far away from the suffocating confines of proper society. Margaret, or Maggie as she preferred, had come west with dreams bigger than the Montana sky. At 22, she had abandoned the restrictive life waiting for her in Boston, a suitable marriage, children, and endless dinner parties discussing nothing of consequence. Instead, she had answered her uncle's invitation to help manage his newspaper in the growing town of Willow Creek. The townspeople had taken to her immediately, charmed by her enthusiasm and vitality. But that charm had begun to wear thin for some. "That Ellwood girl," they whispered, "always has something to say, doesn't she? And must she say it so loudly?" Maggie guided her horse back toward town, unaware that her morning ritual of singing to the rising sun had garnered her a secret audience. Lucas Keller, foreman of the neighboring Double Cross Ranch, had been out checking fence lines when he first heard her voice carrying across the prairie 3 weeks ago. Every morning since, he found some reason to be in the same area, listening to the joyful, uninhibited sound of her songs. Today, as Maggie approached the outskirts of Willow Creek, her mare suddenly reared, startled by a rattlesnake slithering across the path. Maggie's scream pierced the morning quiet as she was thrown from the saddle, landing hard on the unforgiving ground. Lucas spurred his stallion forward from where he'd been watching among a stand of cottonwoods. He reached her in seconds, dismounting before his horse had fully stopped. "Miss, are you all right?" Maggie sat up slowly, dusty and disoriented. "I think so." She looked up at the tall cowboy hovering over her, his face shadowed by his hat. "Just my pride that's bruised." She attempted to stand but winced as pain shot through her ankle. Best not put weight on that yet. Lucas knelt beside her, gentle hands examining her ankle. "Might be sprained." "I'm Lucas Keller, foreman at the Double Cross. Margaret Ellwood. Most call me Maggie." She studied him as he tended to her broad shoulders, strong hands that touched her ankle with surprising delicacy, and eyes the color of a summer storm. "Thank you for coming to my rescue, Mr. Keller." "Lucas," he corrected, his voice deep and steady, "and it's no trouble. Been meaning to introduce myself anyway." He hesitated, a slight flush coloring his tanned face. "I've heard you singing. Mornings out on the range." Maggie felt heat rise to her cheeks, but not from embarrassment. "And you didn't ride off in the opposite direction. Most folks in town think I'm too loud for a lady." Lucas's eyes met hers, serious and direct. "Way I see it, Miss Ellwood, your voice is about the only thing around here worth hearing." The words hung between them, simple and honest, creating a connection neither had expected. Lucas cleared his throat, breaking the moment. "We should get you back to town, have the doctor look at that ankle." He helped her onto his horse, then mounted behind her. The solid warmth of his chest against her back made Maggie acutely aware of his presence as they rode toward Willow Creek. "So you work for the newspaper?" Lucas asked as they rode. "I do. My uncle owns the Willow Creek Gazette, but his health isn't what it used to be. I came out from Boston to help." Maggie shifted slightly, trying to ignore the pleasant sensation of being held securely in his arms. "And you, Mr. Keller Lucas, have you always been a rancher?" "Since I was old enough to throw a rope. Worked my way up from ranch hand to foreman. Planning to have my own spread someday." There was quiet determination in his voice. As they entered town, several heads turned to watch them pass. Maggie was painfully aware of how this looked being carried into town by a man she barely knew, her hair wind-blown and her dress dusty. Mrs. Abernathy, the town's most prolific gossip, stood outside the general store and made no attempt to hide her disapproval. "That Ellwood girl," she said loudly enough to be heard, "always causing some spectacle." Lucas felt Maggie stiffen in his arms. Without slowing his horse, he tipped his hat to Mrs. Abernathy and said clearly, "Morning, madam. Just helping Miss Ellwood after a riding accident. Lucky I was there to hear her call for help." At the doctor's office, Lucas helped Maggie inside, explaining the situation to Dr. Wilson before reluctantly taking his leave. "I'll check on you tomorrow if that's all right," he said, hat in hand. "I'd like that," Maggie replied, surprised by how much she meant it. The next day, Lucas arrived at the newspaper office with a small bouquet of wildflowers. Maggie's ankle was bandaged but not seriously injured. She sat at her desk, working on the layout for the next edition, her uncle dozing in a chair by the window. "These are for you," Lucas said, placing the flowers on her desk. "How's the ankle? Just a mild sprain." "Thank you for these," she touched the delicate petals. "They're beautiful." Her uncle stirred, awakened by their voices. "Who's this, Maggie?" he asked, adjusting his spectacles. "Uncle Henry, this is Lucas Keller, the man who helped me yesterday. Lucas, my uncle, Henry Ellwood." Henry scrutinized Lucas, then extended a bony hand. "Appreciate you looking after my niece, young man. She's precious cargo." "Yes, sir, I know that." Lucas's response was simple but carried a weight that made Maggie look at him more closely. Over the next few weeks, Lucas found reasons to visit town more frequently. He would stop by the newspaper office, sometimes bringing Maggie interesting stories from the ranch or the surrounding areas. Occasionally, they would share lunch at the small cafe across the street, deep in conversation that ranged from books to politics to their dreams for the future. Maggie discovered that behind Lucas's quiet demeanor lay a sharp mind and thoughtful opinions. He had taught himself to read from newspapers and dime novels, developing a hunger for knowledge that matched her own. Lucas found himself enchanted by Maggie's passion for life, her fearlessness in expressing her thoughts, and the way her eyes lit up when she talked about making a difference through her writing. But not everyone viewed their growing friendship with approval. The whispers around town intensified. Maggie was too outspoken, too independent for a woman. She expressed political opinions in her newspaper columns. She rode astride instead of side saddle. And now she was being courted by a cowboy with no family name, no fortune. One evening, as Lucas walked Maggie home from a town meeting where she had spoken passionately about the need for a proper schoolhouse, Mrs. Abernathy and her circle of friends watched from the boardwalk. "That girl needs to learn her place," Mrs. Abernathy said loudly. "No man wants a wife whose voice carries across the territory." Lucas felt Maggie falter beside him, saw her bright expression dim. Without hesitation, he turned to face the women. "Evening, ladies," he said, his voice carrying just far enough. "Seems to me a woman with something important to say should be heard. Miss Ellwood's voice is music to these ears." He offered Maggie his arm and continued walking, leaving the stunned women behind. "You shouldn't have to defend me," Maggie said quietly. "I wasn't defending you," Lucas replied. "You can do that yourself. I was just speaking the truth." As summer turned to autumn, their relationship deepened. Lucas began teaching Maggie to shoot, believing every woman in the West should know how to protect herself. Maggie introduced Lucas to the works of Whitman and Emerson, reading aloud by lantern light on her uncle's porch as the stars emerged overhead. "You have a gift," Lucas told her one evening as she finished reading. "The way you bring words to life, that's why your voice should never be silenced." In October, tragedy struck when a fire broke out at the newspaper office. Maggie and her uncle were working late, preparing the next day's edition, when the flames spread rapidly from a neighboring building. Lucas, in town to deliver cattle to the rail yard, saw the smoke and ran toward the blaze. He found Henry outside, coughing and distressed. "Maggie's still in there," the old man gasped, pointing to the burning building. "She went back for the press plates." Without hesitation, Lucas wrapped his bandana around his face and plunged into the smoke-filled office. The heat was intense, flames licking at the wooden walls and ceiling beams. "Maggie," he shouted, squinting through the smoke. "Here." Her voice came from the back room where the printing press stood. Lucas found her trying to salvage the metal plates for the front page, coughing as smoke filled her lungs. "Leave them," he ordered, grabbing her arm. "Your life is worth more than any story." A burning beam crashed down behind them, blocking their path to the front door. Lucas pulled Maggie close, shielding her with his body as he guided her toward the back exit. They burst out into the alley, gasping for fresh air as the building continued to burn behind them. When they reached safety, Lucas turned to Maggie, his face blackened with soot, his eyes intense with fear and something deeper. Without a word, he pulled her into his arms and kissed her, not caring who might see. "I thought I might lose you," he said when they finally broke apart. "And I never told you, I know," Maggie interrupted, her hands framing his face. "I know." The fire destroyed the newspaper office and damaged several adjacent buildings. In the aftermath, the town council met to discuss rebuilding. Maggie attended, her voice strong as she advocated for her uncle's newspaper to be included in the reconstruction plans. "The Gazette has been the voice of this community for 15 years, she argued. "It's more than a business, it's a public service." "Perhaps this is a sign that your uncle should retire," suggested Mr. Peterson, the bank manager. "And you, Miss Ellwood, might consider more appropriate pursuits for a young lady. Your enthusiasm can be quite overwhelming." Whispers of agreement circulated the room. Lucas, sitting at the back, stood up. The room quieted as he walked to Maggie's side. "I don't often speak at these meetings," he began, his deep voice commanding attention. "But I need to say something. This town needs the Gazette. And it needs people like Miss Ellwood who aren't afraid to speak up for what's right. Some of you say she's too loud." He paused, looking around the room. "I say she's the only one worth hearing." He turned to Maggie, taking her hand. "And I'll put my money behind those words. I've been saving to buy my own ranch, but I'm offering that money now to rebuild the Gazette. As an investment, not charity." The room erupted in discussion. By the end of the meeting, a plan was in place to rebuild the newspaper office, with Lucas as a business partner in the enterprise. As they walked home under a canopy of stars, Maggie stopped Lucas with a hand on his arm. "Why did you do that? That was your dream, your own ranch." Lucas took both her hands in his. "Some dreams change, Maggie, or maybe they just get bigger." He looked into her eyes, no longer hiding what he felt. "I love you. Your voice, your mind, your courage, everything about you." "Even though I'm too loud?" she asked, vulnerability beneath her teasing tone. "Especially because you're too loud. This world tries to silence women like you, don't ever let it." They were married that December, a simple ceremony in the newly rebuilt church. As snow fell softly outside, Maggie and Lucas exchanged vows, promising to stand beside each other through whatever life brought their way. The rebuilt Gazette office opened in the spring of 1876. Henry remained as editor, with Maggie writing much of the content and Lucas managing the business side when he wasn't working at the Double Cross. The newspaper flourished, gaining subscribers throughout the territory for its honest reporting and thoughtful editorials. A year later, Lucas had saved enough again to make a down payment on a small ranch adjacent to the Double Cross. It wasn't much a sturdy cabin, a barn needing repairs, and 50 acres of decent grazing land, but it was theirs. They named it Echo Valley, for the way Maggie's voice carried across the meadow when she sang in the mornings. Life wasn't always easy. The harsh Wyoming winters tested their resilience. The newspaper business faced competition as the territory grew. And there were those in town who never quite accepted Maggie's outspoken ways, or her marriage to a man who had arrived in Willow Creek with nothing but the clothes on his back, and a determination to build something of his own. But together, they built a life rich in purpose and love. Maggie's articles began appearing in newspapers as far away as Denver and San Francisco. Lucas's careful management expanded their ranch to neighboring parcels as they became available. In the spring of 1878, their family grew with the birth of their daughter, Emma. From the beginning, the baby seemed to have inherited her mother's powerful lungs, her cries echoing through their cabin at all hours of the night. "She's definitely your daughter," Lucas yawned one morning after a particularly restless night. Voice that could carry to California. Maggie smiled tiredly, cradling their infant daughter. "Does it bother you?" Lucas wrapped his arms around both of them. "Not one bit. I told you, your voice is the only one worth hearing. Now there's two of you, and that's twice the blessing." As Emma grew, so did their family's place in the community. Maggie started a small school in a corner of the newspaper office, teaching children to read and write in the afternoons after the day's edition had been printed. Lucas's reputation as a fair businessman and skilled rancher earned him respect even from those who had once looked down on him. In 1880, tragedy and opportunity arrived simultaneously. Henry Ellwood passed away peacefully in his sleep, leaving the Gazette to Maggie and Lucas. That same week, the owner of the Double Cross Ranch announced his intention to sell and return east. "We could buy it," Lucas said one evening as they sat on their porch, watching the sunset paint the mountains in purple and gold. "Between what we've saved and what the bank would lend against the Gazette, we could make an offer." Maggie was quiet for a moment, unusual for her. "Is that what you want, to be a full-time rancher?" Lucas considered the question seriously. "I want us to build something that lasts. Something for Emma and any other children we might have." He took her hand. "But only if you're with me every step. Your voice needs to be heard, Maggie. The newspaper gives you that. What if we could do both?" Maggie's eyes lit with the excitement Lucas had fallen in love with. "We could move the Gazette to the ranch. With the new printing press, we don't need as much space. We could hire someone to help with the daily operations. A ranching operation and a newspaper run from the same place." Lucas raised an eyebrow. "Why not?" "We've never done things the conventional way." Maggie's mind was already racing with possibilities. "Think about it, Lucas. A voice for the ranchers and farmers that doesn't come from the town businesses. Stories about the real West, written by people living it." Lucas shook his head in wonder. "Just when I think your ideas can't get any bigger." "Too loud?" she asked with a smile. "Perfect," he answered, pulling her close. They made their offer on the Double Cross Ranch the following day. After 2 weeks of negotiations, they signed the papers, making them the owners of one of the largest cattle operations in the county. The previous owner even agreed to leave most of the furnishings in the main house, a sprawling 2-story structure that dwarfed their cabin at Echo Valley. Moving the newspaper operation took careful planning. They converted an unused bunkhouse into the new Gazette office, installing the printing press and setting up typesetting tables. Maggie hired Sarah Jensen, a young widow with a head for business, to manage the day-to-day operations while Maggie focused on writing and editing. Their first edition, printed from the ranch, featured a bold editorial from Maggie about the changing face of the West, the importance of preserving its wild beauty while building communities of substance. Letters poured in, some supportive, others critical of a woman expressing such strong opinions. Lucas saved every letter, even the negative ones, proud of the impact his wife's words were having. "They still say I'm too loud," Maggie remarked one evening, reading a particularly scathing letter from a rancher's wife who believed women should confine their opinions to household matters. "Let them talk," Lucas replied, looking up from where he sat teaching 5-year-old Emma to read. "You're changing minds, Maggie, not all at once, but bit by bit. That's why they are afraid." In the summer of 1882, the governor of Wyoming Territory visited the Double Cross Ranch. Having read Maggie's articles advocating for women's suffrage and fair treatment of Native American tribes, he wanted to meet the woman behind the powerful words. The visit coincided with a gathering of neighboring ranchers to discuss water rights, creating an unexpected forum for Maggie's ideas. Initially, many of the men were resistant to hearing a woman speak on political matters. But Lucas, now respected as one of the most successful ranchers in the region, stood beside his wife. "Gentlemen," he addressed the assembled group, "my wife has studied these issues more thoroughly than anyone in this territory. You'd be fools not to listen." What began as reluctant attention soon turned to genuine engagement as Maggie outlined her proposals for equitable water access and sustainable grazing practices. By the end of the discussion, even her staunchest critics were considering her points. The governor, impressed by both her knowledge and her delivery, invited Maggie to address the territorial legislature on women's suffrage the following month. It would mean traveling to Cheyenne and leaving Emma and the newspaper for nearly 2 weeks. "You should go," Lucas told her that night as they discussed the invitation. "This is what you've worked for. But the Gazette and Emma, Sarah can handle the paper. Emma and I will manage just fine." He took her hands in his. "Your voice deserves to be heard beyond this valley, Maggie." "I've always known that." The journey to Cheyenne marked a turning point. Maggie's speech to the legislature was reported in newspapers across the country. Her passionate advocacy for women's right to vote in Wyoming Territory, which had been granted in 1869 but faced constant challenges, and her articulate defense of Western values captured national attention. When she returned home, it was to a hero's welcome orchestrated by Lucas. The entire community gathered at the ranch for a celebration that lasted well into the night. Even Mrs. Abernathy attended, grudgingly admitting that perhaps Maggie's excessive volume had its uses after all. As the years passed, the Double Cross Ranch prospered, as did the Gazette. Emma grew into a confident young woman with her mother's spirit and her father's steady determination. In 1884, the family welcomed twin boys, Henry and James, completing their family. Lucas and Maggie's partnership became legendary in the territory. They faced challenges together: drought years that threatened the cattle, economic downturns that affected the newspaper, political opposition to their progressive ideas. Through it all, they remained each other's strongest supporters. In 1890, Wyoming became the first state to grant women the right to vote as it entered the Union. Maggie covered the historic event for the Gazette, her article reprinted in newspapers nationwide. At the celebration in Cheyenne, she was asked to speak to the assembled crowd. Lucas watched from the side of the stage, as proud as the day he'd first heard her voice singing across the prairie 15 years earlier. Beside him stood their children, Emma, now a poised 17-year-old, the twins energetic at 6. "Your mama has the loudest voice in Wyoming," commented an older man standing nearby. Lucas smiled, his eyes never leaving Maggie as she captivated the crowd with her words. "Yes, sir, she does. And it's still the only one worth hearing." Later that night, as they stood on the balcony of their hotel room overlooking the streets of Cheyenne, Maggie leaned into Lucas's embrace. "Did you ever imagine, that day you found me thrown from my horse, that we'd end up here?" Lucas considered the question, his arms tightening around her. "Not the details, no, but I knew you were special. I'd been listening to you sing for weeks, remember? Your voice called to something in me before we ever spoke. And now you've had to listen to that voice for 15 years, Maggie teased. Still not tired of it?" Lucas turned her to face him, his expression serious in the moonlight. "Maggie, loving your voice, loud as it may be, was the easy part. Loving the woman behind it, standing beside you through everything we've faced, watching you change the world with your words. That's been the privilege of my life." They returned to the ranch to find the autumn colors painting their valley in crimson and gold. The Gazette continued to grow in influence. The ranch expanded as neighboring properties became available. Their children thrived, Emma showing a talent for writing that rivaled her mother's, the twins more interested in the ranching side of the family business. In 1895, for their 20th wedding anniversary, Lucas surprised Maggie with a gift that left her speechless. For perhaps the first time in her life, a small printing press of her own, installed in a sunlit room he had added to their house. "For your book," he explained, watching her run her hands over the gleaming machinery. "All those stories you've been writing in your journal, it's time the world heard them too." Tears filled Maggie's eyes. "How did you know? I listened to you, remember?" "Even when you think I'm not paying attention," he smiled. "Your voice is still the only one worth hearing." The book of short stories and essays, published the following year under the title Echoes from the West, received acclaim from critics in New York and Boston. Maggie Ellwood Keller became known not just as a newspaper editor and suffragist, but as one of the authentic literary voices of the American West. Through the years that followed, through joys and sorrows, triumphs and challenges, Lucas and Maggie remained each other's strongest advocates. When others said she was too loud, too opinionated, too everything, he was the one who reminded the world, and sometimes Maggie herself, that hers was the voice that mattered. And in the quiet moments, when the day's work was done and they sat together on the porch of the home they had built, watching the sun set behind the mountains, no words were needed at all. In the silence between them was the deepest understanding. That love doesn't require volume to be heard, but it does demand the courage to listen, especially to the voices society tries to silence. As Maggie approached her 60th birthday in 1913, with grandchildren playing in the yard where once their own children had run, she and Lucas could look back on a life that had defied every expectation. The loud-voiced Boston girl and the quiet cowboy had created something remarkable together, a legacy of words and deeds that would echo long after they were gone. "Do you ever regret it?" Maggie asked him one evening as they watched their family gathered for dinner on the lawn. "Hitching your wagon to such a noisy star," Lucas, silver now threading his still thick hair, took her hand in his weathered one. His eyes, though lined with the years, still held the same steady gaze that had first seen the truth of her all those years ago. "Not for a single moment," he said. "Every day, I thank God that I was in the right place to hear your voice when so many others were determined not to listen. You were never too loud, Maggie. The world was just too quiet." And in that moment, as in all the moments that had built their life together, his words were the only ones worth hearing.